A woman, a wealthy one by the look of it, kneels down in her pantry and starts digging a hole in the floor. Into it goes everything she owns that is worth anything: silver bracelets, a purse of coins. She fills the hole back in. Directly above the hiding place, on a wooden shelf, her dinner is going cold, a meal she never got the chance to finish. A short while later, the house erupts in flame, the shelf collapses, the food spills across the floor, and the woman runs out and never comes back. Or perhaps she never runs at all, and stays there for good. That much we will never know. It is worth asking what actually did this. No wild horde comes sweeping in, no volcano erupts, none of the great catastrophes you would expect behind a scar like that in the ground. The town is called Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the first Roman colony in Britain. And immediately after it, the same hand wipes Londinium, modern London, off the face of the earth. The one responsible is no mystical warrior out of the woods. This is where it gets interesting, because the culprit is a woman. And no, this is not another Netflix reworking of history. A woman leads a war in a world where weapons are carried, almost without exception, by men. That makes for an interesting change. Her name is Boudica. And now for the best part. 2,000 years later, the British put up an enormous bronze monument to the same woman who burned London down to bare earth. It stands beside the Thames, right next to Parliament. Did she earn it? We are about to find out. Let us jump to the other end of that world, to Rome, where the throne is occupied by a young man who will shortly go down in history as one of the worst and most spectacularly screwed up, let us call it twisted, emperors this story has ever seen. His name is Nero, and this Nero, according to his biographer Suetonius, at some point considers something unthinkable for Roman pride. He considers pulling the army out of Britain and abandoning the island altogether. He thinks about giving it back and walking away. Suetonius, to be fair to him, gives no date. He writes by theme rather than in sequence. But most scholars pin that thought of evacuation to one particular moment. The moment the news reaches Rome that the Roman towns on the island have been reduced to ash, and that around 80,000 people are dead. One question before the story starts. Do you think Europe would be a better place to live if the Roman Empire had survived? And is it even possible for any empire to last 2,000 years? Let me know in the comments. Start with this. Rome does not come crashing into Britain out of a love of adventure. It comes because one particular man needs a military success, and needs it quickly. That man is Claudius, the emperor nobody wanted, limping, stammering, hauled onto the throne by the Praetorian Guard, partly out of desperation and partly as a joke, and desperate for something that will give him a real triumph through the streets of Rome, that lavish victor's procession across the whole city. A war at the edge of the known world, on an island wrapped in legend, suits the purpose perfectly. And it is worth adding that 3 years earlier, Caligula, his mad predecessor, tried exactly this, and it ended in one of the most embarrassing expeditions in the history of the Roman army, turned back somewhere on the Channel coast in an atmosphere of farce. So Claudius has something to prove, that he can do what the lunatic before him could not. The pretext turns up on its own, as pretexts usually do. A certain so-called king of the Atrebates, one Boudicca, a man tucked deep into Rome's pocket, and I will not say which pocket, gets himself driven out of his own country by his neighbours, and comes running to Rome for help. And that is enough. In the year 43, Claudius sends an army across the sea under an experienced senator, Aulus Plautius. 4 legions, plus roughly the same number of auxiliary units, some 40,000 men in all. One of those legions, the 2nd Augusta, is commanded by an officer the world will hear from again, because his name is Vespasian, and one day he will be emperor himself. That, though, is another story. Let us get back to the beach. The Romans land, most probably somewhere near modern Richborough in Kent, and they land against very little resistance, because the Britons honestly do not believe anyone will actually make the crossing. The resistance comes later. It is led by 2 brothers from the strongest tribe in this part of the island, the Catuvellauni, Caraticus and Togodumnus. They fight cleverly, at the rivers, but against the Roman machine, cleverness alone only lasts so long. Togodumnus is killed. Caraticus escapes west and knocks about the mountains of Wales for years, running a guerrilla war, until at last, and this is the bitter part, it is not a Roman cohort that hands him over, but his own side. He takes refuge with the powerful queen of the north, Cartimandua, ruler of the Brigantes, counting on Celtic solidarity. Cartimandua has him put in chains and delivers him to the Romans. In the year 51, Caraticus, the last great leader of the resistance, walks in irons through a Roman parade of victory. So much for Celtic solidarity, because that is the first thing to understand about this island. Britain is not one nation bravely standing up to an invader. It is a mosaic of tribes who hate each other at least as much as they hate Rome, and often a good deal more. When the Romans arrive, the Dobuni, previously forced into obedience by the Catuvelloni, greet Aulus Plautius with something close to relief and surrender without a fight, because the enemy of my enemy, and so on. Another local ruler, one Cogidubnus, backs Rome from the start, receives the status of client king for it, and, as is generally supposed, a gigantic palace at Fishbourne, one of the largest Roman buildings north of the Alps. Rome does not have to conquer the whole island with the sword. It only has to read who hates whom, and stand on the right side. Now the most important thing, without which none of the rest makes sense. Rome does not rule Britain the way people picture it today, with a sword on every street corner. Rome rules by arrangement. There is even a legal formula for it. Rex sociusque et amicus. King, ally, and friend of the Roman people. It sounds dignified. In practice, it means a simple deal. The local ruler keeps his throne, mints his own coin, minds his own customs, and in return, he stays loyal, supplies troops when Rome wants them, and keeps his own people in order. A kingdom like that is called a client kingdom. And this is where the trap sits. The arrangement is not made with a nation. It is made with one specific man. It binds one king to one emperor, personally, more like an agreement between 2 individuals than a constitution. Which means that by its very nature, it dies when the king dies. It does not usually pass to the son. The ruler dies, and Rome decides for itself whether to renew the arrangement with his successor, or simply take the whole territory and turn it into an ordinary province. Guess which option Rome prefers? And this is no British exception. Pergamum was swallowed in exactly this way, and Galatia and Mauritania. Pergamum is a fine story in its own right, because there the king wrote the entire kingdom over to Rome in his will, handed it across on a plate and... Alright, no. Let us leave Pergamum alone, because once I start, I will not stop. Another time. Back to Britain. The pattern runs the same way for generations. Merciless, and entirely legal on top of that. The king dies, and his kingdom, as if by the touch of a wand, becomes the property of Rome. The tribe that enters into an arrangement like this is the Iceni, somewhere in the eastern part of the island, in what is now Norfolk. Their king is called Prasutagus, and the Iceni already have a bone to pick with Rome, because this is not their first dance. 14 years before the Great Rising, in the year 47, the Roman governor Ostorius Scapula has a brilliant idea. For everyone's safety, the allied tribes on the near side of a certain line of rivers should be disarmed. He wants their weapons taken away. For a proud, warlike people, being disarmed is not a formality. It says outright that you are no longer an ally, but livestock. The Iceni take up the very weapons they are meant to surrender, dig in at a site archaeologists connect with Stonia Camp, and lose. But they remember, and it is probably only after that revolt that Rome raises the compliant Prasutagus to their throne, its own man, the sort who will not cause trouble. For the rest of his life, he causes none. The trouble starts only when he dies. And now the money, because money usually decides these things, though in textbooks it tends to get lost between the battles. The Roman conquest of Britain is financed to a large extent privately, on credit, and one of the creditors is, brace yourself, Seneca. Yes, that Seneca, the philosopher, the Stoic, the author of lofty treatises on how money does not make a man happy. According to Cassius Dio, that same Seneca pushed loans onto the British aristocracy to the staggering sum of 40 million sesterces, the Roman coin, expecting a fat rate of interest, and then, overnight, demanded the whole lot back. He demanded it brutally, and he sent men to collect. Whether that actually happened, we do not entirely know, and I have to be straight with you here. Dio was writing a century and a half after the events, and by then Seneca was already a ready-made symbol of hypocrisy, the sage preaching contempt for wealth, who had made his own fortune from money-lending. The British Seneca scholar Miriam Griffin suspected that dropping Seneca into this story as the chief architect of the massacre may have been a literary kick at the Roman elite, rather than reporting. Tacitus, who rarely passed up a chance to take the administration by the ear, does not mention these dealings of Seneca's at all. So I would not treat it as settled. Driving the locals into debt was real, and it was widespread. That much we know. Whether Seneca personally lit the fuse, I would not swear to. And one more thing. Quiet, but important. Every single thing we know about this island and these people was written down by the people who conquered it. There is not one sentence set down by a British hand. Not one survives. This entire story I am laying out for you is a Roman pen on Roman paper. Keep that in mind. We will come back to it when things start getting properly bloody, because that is when it will matter who was holding the paper. The will nobody wanted to read, honestly. Prasutagus dies. We do not know exactly when, we do not know of what. The sources are silent here, and I am not going to invent an illness nobody recorded. What we do know is what he leaves behind. He leaves a will, and that will is clever, or at least it is meant to be. Prasutagus divides his kingdom in two, half to his two daughters, half to the Roman emperor. The logic is as simple as a hammer. Give the emperor a share, the emperor is pleased to have got something without a war, and in return, he leaves the family in peace. Another arrangement, because arrangements are what this whole island runs on. Because there is something in this story that escaped Prasutagus himself, and it is devastating. That will is without precedent. No Roman rule recognized anything of the kind, leaving the emperor half a kingdom on the assumption that the family would keep the other half. Under Roman law, a kingdom like that reverted to the emperor on the king's death anyway. All of it, not half of it. By making the emperor co-heir, Prasutagus effectively hands Rome a written invitation to walk in and take whatever it fancies. And tellingly, his wife does not appear in that will at all. Boudica inherits nothing. She is left out. Perhaps Prasutagus reckoned that, as the mother of royal daughters, she would be safe regardless. If that is what he reckoned, he was spectacularly wrong. Rome reads the will its own way. The provincial procurator, the money man, one Catus Decianus, moves in and seizes everything. He confiscates the royal estate, and afterwards his people go after the debts, those famous debts, collecting them from the tribal nobility, with all the delicacy a debt collector usually brings to the job, which is to say, none. Now we reach the scene that begins the real rising, the one Tacitus describes briefly, because Tacitus was a stylist of economical horror and knew that the fewer the words, the harder they land. Boudica, the king's widow, is ordered to be publicly flogged. Her 2 daughters suffer the worst thing that can happen to young girls in the hands of victors. The outrage is personal and it is public, both at once, and the combination of those 2 things turns private pain into a political fire. Had only Boudica been harmed, she would have been one of thousands of harmed people. But a queen is humiliated in front of her own people, and with that, the whole people is humiliated. A widow is turned into a war leader. They did that to themselves. It is worth stopping here for a moment over something that is murky to us and was clear as day to the Britons. To a Roman, a woman at the head of an army was an aberration, an oddity, something against nature. To the Britons, not in the slightest. Tacitus himself admits, in one sentence that always strikes me, that the Britons drew no distinction of sex where power was concerned. Cartimandua rules the Brigantes in the north. Boudica will lead half the island. There is nothing shocking in it for them. That whole later picture of Boudica as a monster, an unnatural woman, vengeful beyond measure, is not a British view. It is a Roman problem with being thrashed by someone who, in Roman eyes, had no business thrashing anyone. And now the other half of that same moment. Because while Boudica is being flogged in the east, something is happening in the west that explains why the entire island suddenly goes up in flames. The governor of Britain, General Suetonius Paulinus, is not around. And let me flag this straight away so there is no confusion. This is not the biographer Suetonius from the beginning of our story, but a different man altogether who happened to carry the same Roman name. He is at the far end of the country, as far away as it is possible to be, on the Welsh island of Mona, modern Anglesey. And he is doing something there that from Rome's point of view is pure business, and from the British point of view is the end of the world. He is exterminating the Druids. It is worth getting inside both heads for a second, because without that we will not understand why this mattered so much. For Rome, religion was a kind of social contract. Foreign gods were usually absorbed, added to the pantheon, and that was that. But the Druids were different. They directed a cult that, according to Roman accounts, sometimes required human sacrifice, and that crossed the boundary of Roman tolerance. For Rome, this was not religion, religio, but superstition, superstitio, a dangerous fanaticism that had to be burned out. For the Britons, the Druids were the glue, the memory, the law, and the faith, all in one. To strike at the Druids was to strike at the core of what the Britons were. Mona is the last great refuge of these priests, a shelter for anyone who has fled from Rome. And Paulinus, ambitious to a fault, dreaming of matching the fame of the great Corbulo, who at that very moment is winning Armenia back for the emperor, decides to tear that heart out. Tacitus speaks of ambition and of glory, and I believe him, because a general's ambition explains more things in history than anything else does. Paulinus builds flat-bottomed boats, ferries his infantry across the Menai Strait, sends the cavalry through the ford or swimming alongside their horses, and lands on the far shore. And on that shore a sight is waiting that Tacitus described in a way that is hard to forget. Listen, because these are his words, in translation. Along the shore stood the enemy line of battle, an unbroken mass of arms and men, and among them ran women in the black robes of mourning, hair loose, brandishing torches in the manner of the Furies. Around them stood the Druids, hands raised to the sky, pouring out prayers and curses. The strangeness of it so terrified our soldiers that they stood as though their limbs had turned to stone. End of quote. The Roman legionary is a trained machine that has seen everything life has to offer. And suddenly, that machine stops dead in front of a crowd of women with torches and old men throwing curses. They freeze. They stand there motionless and let themselves be wounded, until the officers start bellowing at them not to be frightened of a pack of women and fanatics. Then they move, and once they move, they do what Rome does best. They kill everyone. The sacred oak groves, where according to the Roman chroniclers, the Druids read the future in human entrails, they do not spare either. They level them. Tacitus offers the justification himself, that the Britons considered it proper to offer the blood of prisoners on their altars, and to consult the gods through human innards. And I have to stop you here for a moment, because this matters, and it is easy to get carried away. Did the Druids really make bloody sacrifices of prisoners? Or is this Roman propaganda, the kind that turned every enemy into a savage, so that killing him would be more convenient? We have a rare piece of counter-evidence for that, and it comes from the bottom of a lake. On Anglesey, at a place called Llyn Cerrig Bach, in the year 1942, workers extending an airfield runway pulled a hoard out of the peat bog. More than 150 objects, swords, spearheads, fragments of chariots, horse bits, and among them a heavy iron chain for shackling slaves. The director of the Welsh Museum at the time, Cyril Fox, connected that chain with Tacitus in 1946 and announced that here was the proof that the Druids had been bringing prisoners here for sacrifice. Except that modern archaeology says, steady on, Mr. Fox. The dating showed that these objects did not go into the water during one battle or one bloody ritual. They were thrown into the lake over more than 400 years, gift after gift, as votive offerings. They came from all over the British Isles, from Ireland, from Yorkshire, which means Mona was a sacred place for the whole island, not just for the neighbourhood. But the human remains, those altars dripping with the blood of prisoners, were not found. What was found were animal bones, oxen, horses, sheep. None of which means the Celts never practiced human sacrifice at all. They did, and we know it from more than Tacitus. Caesar describes the burning of condemned men inside a great wicker figure. Pliny mentions the practice, and a body was pulled out of a British bog, belonging to a man who died a death that was ritual to an excessive degree. So the point is not that the Romans invented it, the point is what they used it for. It is easier to slaughter priests and cut down their sacred groves once you have established that they were bloody savages. The bloody altar on Mona may have been real, and it may not. but in Tacitus's hands it mainly serves to justify a massacre. And while Paulinus is standing in the ruins of Mona, satisfied, his glory almost in his grasp, a message reaches him. Somewhere behind his back, at the other end of the island, the province is burning. Boudicca does not move alone. This is the point where the widow of a local ruler does the thing Rome completely failed to anticipate. She unites the tribes. The Iceni are joined by the Trinovantes, neighbours who have their own very fresh accounts to settle with Rome, accounts dug up out of their own soil. Because on Trinovantian territory, at Camulodunum, Rome planted a colony of its veterans, and those veterans, as Tacitus writes, drove the locals out of their houses, took their fields, and treated them as prisoners and slaves on their own land. And it has to be said fairly that Rome did this everywhere. A veteran colony was routine, a way of policing freshly conquered ground and of paying soldiers off inland. Except that no amount of routine makes the injury smaller for the people it lands on. On top of that came the temple, that wretched temple of Claudius, whose cult the local priests, chosen from among the Britons, had to fund out of their own fortunes, to the point of ruin. The Trinovantes do not need a grand ideology to pick up weapons. They only need to see that somebody has finally gone first. Boudicca goes first. And this whole swelling mass moves on a single target, chosen deliberately and chosen out of spite. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the first Roman colony on the island, a town of settled veterans, and above all, a town with a temple. Because at Camulodunum stands a temple dedicated to the divine Claudius, the same Claudius who conquered the island. Enormous, built of concrete on a stone podium, surrounded by a sacred precinct and a monumental triumphal arch from the time of the invasion. To the Romans, a matter of pride. To the Britons, in the words of the Roman historian, a stronghold of everlasting domination, an altar to a foreign god that they were forced to pay for out of their own pockets. It would be hard to design a better symbol to burn. There is a small detail here that always stops me, a little loop in time. That podium of the Temple of Claudius, the massive concrete foundation with its 4 chambers packed with sand, survived. It survived the fire, it survived the centuries, and ages later the Normans built their castle on top of it without even knowing what they were building on. The archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler only recognised this in 1920, which means the core of the Norman castle in Colchester is the foundation of the Roman temple Boudica tried to wipe off the face of the earth. She did not manage it. It is standing there today. Tacitus adds something else just before the disaster, one of those passages where the stern Roman historian suddenly turns almost ghoulish. Shortly before Boudica arrives, strange things start happening at Camulodunum. The statue of the goddess Victory falls for no reason and lands facing backwards, as though fleeing from an enemy. Women in a trance cry out that destruction is coming. In the council building, strange wailing is heard, and in the theatre, howling. And at the mouth of the Thames, at low tide, something like a drowned town is seen, and the water takes on the colour of blood. Whether these were real signs, or a Roman way of giving the defeat a flavour of destiny after the fact, we cannot settle. The chronicler himself suggests that for the veterans, these omens were both hope and terror, since people believed in them according to their fear. Either way, no sign defended the town. One stone building defended it, and only for 2 days. And the town is defenceless. no walls, no ditches, no ramparts. Because what would veterans want with walls when they are the terror of the district? When Boudica arrives, the procurator Catus Decianus, the man behind the confiscations, sends a relief force of 200 men, poorly armed at that. 200 men against a crowd, Dio put at 120,000. Even if that figure is a gross exaggeration, and it is, there were still many tens of thousands of them. The inhabitants take shelter in the only solid stone in town, the temple of Claudius. They barricade themselves inside and hold out for 2 days. After 2 days, the temple is taken by storm and the town burns to its foundations. At the same time, relief is coming from the northwest. The 9th Legion, Hispana, under Petilius Cerealis. It comes on fast and walks straight into an ambush. Tacitus writes that the victorious Britons broke the legion on the march and cut the entire infantry to pieces, while Cerealis escaped with his cavalry alone back to camp and hid behind the fortifications. It sounds like the annihilation of a whole legion, and for centuries that is how it was read. But modern logistics corrects the legend here, and does it elegantly. Cerealis's base, the fort at Longthorpe near modern Peterborough, held a maximum of 2,800 men. A full legion on paper is around 5,000 heavy infantry, so Cerealis did not lead the whole legion into battle, only a detachment, with the rest scattered among smaller forts. He lost a great deal. He did not lose everything. After the rising, the 9th was topped up with 2,000 men brought over from Germany, and that was enough to make it a legion again. So it was not annihilation. It was a bloody hammering, yes, but it was not the end of the legion. It is interesting, by the way, that Cassius Dio skips this whole episode with the legion, because what excited him was the slaughter of civilians. Every author picks what grips him. And now comes the moment I like best in this whole story, because it shows what command actually is. On hearing all this, poor Linus, with his army dragged over from Wales by forced march, reaches Londinium. That is, London. Not the capital of anything yet, just a thriving trading settlement full of merchants, goods and money, wedged into the marshes by the Thames and the boggy bed of the Walbrook stream, without a single metre of defensive wall. And the Londoners fall at his feet. They beg him to stay and defend them. And Paulinus, as Tacitus writes, is unmoved. He does the sum coldly. He has too few men. The defeat of the 9th is fresh in his memory, and London without walls cannot be held. So he gives the order to roll up the standards. He takes with him those civilians who can keep up with the pace of an army, the weak, the old, and those held in place by their business interests he leaves behind. Tacitus sums it up in one of those sentences that dry out your throat, that he decided to save the whole at the cost of one town. And London burns. After it falls the 3rd town, Verulamium, modern St Albans, the same red layer, the same fire. And the destruction does not stop politely at the boundaries of those 3 towns, because the fire spilled even across the Thames to the southern bank, to the settlement in what is now Southwark, and traces of devastation have been found further out as well, at Silchester, at Staines, at Brentford. The rising was wider than the 3 names in Tacitus suggest. Tacitus listed the ones that made the biggest impression. The ground says it burned in many other places. Let us go underground for longer now, because that red layer holds something I have not said yet. It is not everywhere. It lies exactly where Tacitus names his 3 burned towns, at Colchester, at London, and at St. Albans, and nowhere outside them. This is one of those rare moments when a text 2,000 years old and an archaeologist's spade show precisely the same thing. In London, the layer usually runs from ankle to knee deep, and in filled-in pits, it reaches the height of a stooping man, 1.5 meters of charred city. At Colchester, it is much the same, and on Queen Street, it goes over 1 metre. But thickness is only numbers. What always takes me by the throat is the small things. Under Fenchurch Street in London, an enormous deposit of burnt grain was found, up to 1 metre thick. It was analysed, and out came something that says more than many a chronicle. That grain was imported from across the sea, from the Mediterranean, because growing in it were weeds that had no business growing on this island, and half the grains had been chewed by the granary weevil, which means it had lain in the store a long time before it burned. Why were the Romans shipping grain all the way from the south when Britain had fields of its own? Because that year its own fields failed. The harvest was bad, and hunger arrived just before the revolt, and a hungry man reaches for the pitchfork more readily. That is not proof, it is circumstantial, but it is circumstantial evidence that sits in the stomach. Then there is Colchester. There the fire worked like a lid. It cut off the air and charred everything, leaving the town in a freeze frame, like Pompeii without the volcano. At a site called Lion Walk, a burnt military bed was found in the corner of a room, and beside it charred dates, so well preserved that the stalks were still visible on them. Dates, on an island of rain and fog. Somebody there was eating imported dates and never finished them, because that particular afternoon somebody set fire to the town, and the dates, well, they had to wait 2,000 years. And do you remember the woman we started with? The one who, in the first hours of the attack, buried all her gold in the clay floor of her pantry, with her cooling, half-eaten dinner sitting above the hiding place? That was here, at Colchester, beneath what is now a shop on the high street. Archaeologists dug the group up in 2014 and named it the Fenwick Treasure. I have called it somebody's worst day, and that is exactly the day that left the red layer behind it. That is the fire. We know it for a fact, because we can touch it. Now the part that needs care, because this is where the ground ends and the paper begins. The worst scenes of this rising, the genuinely macabre ones, come from a single source. From Cassius Dio, who was writing 1.5 centuries later and whose text has not survived in the original at all, only in a summary made by a Byzantine monk in the 11th century. Dio describes captured Roman women, those from the best families, hung up naked, their breasts cut off and sewn to their mouths, so that it looked as though they were eating them, and then impaled on long sharpened stakes. All of it accompanied by feasting and singing, in sacred groves, in honour of the Celtic goddess of victory, Andraste. And now pay attention, because this is the heart of it. Tacitus, the author closer to the events, whose father-in-law Agricola served personally in this campaign under Paulinus, does not write a single word about these atrocities. He speaks of slaughter, yes, of the Britons taking no prisoners, of burning and hanging, but those specific, vivid tortures are not in Tacitus. They are only in Dio. And the question has to be asked, why? Why does a man writing 140 years after the fact know more bloody detail than a man who had an eyewitness in the family? The answer most scholars give is an uncomfortable one. Because Dio needed those details. He was writing for a Roman reader, for whom a woman commanding an army was an oddity, an aberration, something unnatural. So Dio made a monster out of Boudica and beasts out of her people, because that made it easier to explain how civilized Rome took such a hammering. There is one more trail that shows nicely how carefully you have to tread on this ground. In the bed of the Walbrook in London, human skulls have long been dug up, blackened, some with broken bones, and for a long time they were presented as victims of Boudica's massacre. Look, the heads of Londoners murdered by the Celtic queen. It sounded splendid, except that the dating of these skulls pointed mostly to the 2nd century, several generations after the Rising, and the injuries are today linked rather to fighting in the arena or to Roman justice, not to Boudica. So the myth fell apart, and the heads that were meant to prove Celtic cruelty turned out to be evidence of the Roman kind instead. Except that nobody wanted to print that second version on postcards. The conclusion is simple, and I stand by it. The red layer proves a fire. It does not prove Dio's story. The fire is in the ground. You can touch it, count it, and give the date it broke out. The atrocities exist only on Roman paper. For a few weeks this rising looked like a triumph. 3 towns in ashes, a legion broken, the governor in retreat, the emperor in Rome thinking about evacuation. The ground confirms that the towns burned. But how exactly the people inside them died, we still know only from the winners. Everything that has worked in Boudica's favour so far is about to turn into her defeat. And it turns in a single battle, whose location, I have to say straight away, we do not know. Scholars argue about it to this day. The name that comes up most often is Mansetta, somewhere west of modern Birmingham, which is what Graham Webster, the leading scholar of this rising, maintained. But a dozen or more other places along the old Roman road have been proposed, and each one sounds as plausible as the next, which means none of them is secure. There is no evidence from the ground at all. No spearhead has ever been found, and no bone either. The field of the greatest battle in the history of Roman Britain has been lost. And it is right that we say so plainly, because it builds honesty rather than undermining the story. Before the clash, Boudica speaks. Or rather, and here again we have to be careful, she speaks in the sense that Tacitus writes her speech for her. In ancient historiography, the speeches of commanders were a convention. The author put into his hero's mouth whatever he thought suited the moment, not a live transcript. Nobody was standing beside Boudica with a stylus, but Tacitus did it well, so let us listen. Boudica, with her daughters before her on the chariot, rides among the separate tribes, and says that the Britons are indeed accustomed to wage war under the leadership of women, but that she is taking her revenge now not as the descendant of great ancestors, but as one of the common people, for freedom taken from her, for a body scourged, for the violated chastity of her daughters. And she ends with a line that lands like a blade. This, she says, is a woman's resolve. As for the men, let them live and be slaves. Cassius Dio adds an even more theatrical scene to this, and here it is quite impossible to say how much truth is in it, but it is too good to leave out, as long as we remember whose hand it is. According to Dio, Boudica stood in front of the crowd, pulled a live hair from the folds of her brightly coloured robe and released it, so as to read an omen from the direction it ran. The hair ran the right way, the crowd roared, and the queen raised her hands to the sky and called out to the goddess Andraste, as one woman to another. It makes a beautiful image, almost certainly invented by Dio, who wanted to show the exotic, wild mysticism of the Britons. But the custom of divining from the run of an animal fits what is known about Celtic practice from elsewhere, so perhaps it is not pure fantasy. Perhaps it is a blend of truth and ornament. It is always like that with Dio. And then comes the battle. On one side poor Linus, with the 14th Legion, detachments of the 20th, and auxiliaries, some 10,000 men in all. There should have been one more legion, the 2nd Augusta, Vespasian's from years back, but its commander, the camp prefect Peneus Posthumus, receives the order to march and ignores it. He takes fright at the scale of the rising and never shifts himself out of barracks. With that single act of cowardice, he deprives his veterans of a share in a battle that will go down in history, and when it finally gets through to him what a victory it was and what glory he missed, he takes his own life. He falls on his own sword out of pure shame. He is a minor figure, one sentence in Tacitus, and I always stop at him, because it is a very human way to disappear from history. On the other side, the huge, uncountable mass of Britons, which Dio inflated to 230,000, a figure that is unreal, because that many people could neither be gathered in one place in the Britain of that time, nor fed afterwards. Let us say honestly, tens of thousands, perhaps up to 100,000. Even so, the Britons outnumber the Romans many times over. And Paulinus, to be fair to him, speaks too, except that his speech is the exact opposite of Boudica's theatre. No hair, no goddess, no lofty appeal to freedom. Tacitus puts into his mouth a few sentences as cold as iron. Do not look at their numbers, he tells his men. Do not listen to their noise. There are more women than warriors in those ranks. They are not soldiers. They are a crowd, and it is about to break. Hold the line, throw your javelins, then push on, with the bosses of your shields and with the sword, and forget about plunder. The plunder comes when it is over. 2 speeches, 2 worlds. She promises revenge and freedom. He promises that the job will be finished, and everyone can go home. And the bitter part is that the second speech turns out to be the truer one. Poor Linus, who evidently has no intention of dying spectacularly, does something brilliantly simple. He chooses the ground. He sets up in a bottleneck, in a defile with the woods at his back. And that one decision cancels the entire British advantage. With woods behind him, he cannot be outflanked. With the defile narrow, that whole mass of many thousands has nowhere to spread out. Only as many Britons can come into the fight at once as fit across the front, and the front is narrow. Numbers stop mattering. 100,000 men who cannot get near you are worth exactly what 10,000 are. Then the machine does its work. It begins with the volley. Tacitus puts a specific order into Paulinus's mouth. The soldiers are to keep close, throw their javelins, and then carry on with the bosses of their shields and their swords, without a thought for plunder. The pilum is a Roman javelin weighing up to 4 kilograms, with a long iron shank and a pyramid-shaped head, designed to punch through a shield and lodge in it for good. A British shield struck by a pilum becomes a useless log that has to be thrown away. And a man without a shield in front of a Roman sword is very nearly a corpse. Then comes the wedge. Tacitus writes that the legion first stood unmoved, holding that narrow place like a fortification, and when the enemy came close and the missiles ran out, it burst forward as though in a wedge. Velut cuneo, the wedge, a formation shaped like a blade driving into the mass of the enemy, was known to the soldiers as the pig's head. A small note for anyone who has seen the films. This was not the testudo, that famous tortoise with shields overhead. The testudo is a siege formation for approaching walls under a hail of arrows. For an attack in the open field it is useless, and neither Tacitus nor Dio mentions it in this battle by a single word. So if anyone shows you Boudica and a Roman tortoise in the same shot, you now know that somebody has not done the reading. And now the mistake that turned a defeat into a butchery, and which is so human that it hurts. The Britons are sure of victory, so sure that they bring their families along to watch the triumph. They draw up their baggage wagons with the women and children behind them, around the edge of the field, like the stands at a stadium. And when the line breaks, when thousands of people throw themselves into flight, there is nowhere to flee. Behind them stands their own wall of wagons, their own wives and children. The Romans drive into that trapped mass and do what they do best. Tacitus gives figures I do not trust as numbers, but do trust as a proportion. Close to 80,000 Britons fell against about 400 Romans. Even if the figures are stretched, the direction of them is right. Nobody could call this a battle. This was an erasure. As for Boudica herself, again I will not pretend to a certainty that does not exist. Tacitus writes that she ended her life with poison by her own hand after the defeat. Dio writes that she fell ill and died, and that the Britons gave her a lavish funeral. 2 versions, 2 Roman pens, and not one British voice to settle between them. And one more curious thing. In an even earlier work of his own, Tacitus makes no mention of poison at all, and puts the end of the rising down to plain sloth. He rather contradicts himself. Where she was buried nobody knows, despite a charming urban legend that has her lying under one of the platforms at King's Cross Station in London, which is of course nonsense without any foundation, but nonsense people want to repeat, because it is pretty. About the fate of her daughters we hear nothing at all. We do not know whether they died, were taken into slavery, or survived. The sources give us silence. Even their names, which sometimes turn up, are the invention of literature 400 years old, not a record from the period. That is what is left of a woman who for a few weeks held the fate of an entire province in her hands. 2 contradictory sentences about how she died, and a grave nobody can find. Rome's revenge is what you would expect, cruel and methodical. Paulinus goes through the tribal lands with fire, pacifying anyone who wavered or sympathized with the revolt. And soon, something worse than the sword arrives, and that is hunger. Because the Britons, counting on an easy victory, neglected their sowing, sent everyone off to the army, and planned to feed themselves from Roman granaries. Those granaries are gone. So after the war comes famine, and it probably takes more people than the battle did. And there is a small twist here that spoils the comfortable picture of the Roman butcher, because it was a Roman who stopped a Roman. The new provincial procurator, Gaius Julius Classicianus, himself a Romanized Gaul from the Treveri, watches Paulinus finishing off a ruined island with vengeful fury, and refusing to accept the surrender of starving people, and concludes that the arithmetic does not work. A dead province pays no taxes. Classicianus starts sending letters to Rome, saying this cannot go on, that Paulinus will depopulate the place entirely. Nero sends his freedman Polyclitus to inspect, with a retinue so large that it frightens even Roman soldiers, and merely amuses the Britons. And in the end, Paulinus, the man who beat Boudica, is recalled. He is replaced by a man with a softer hand, Petronius Turpilianus, who provokes nobody, and whose inactivity, as Tacitus maliciously observes, was dignified with the noble name of peace. And Classicianus has a quiet epilogue of his own, which says more about the passing of things than many a treatise. After his death, a fine stone tomb was raised for him in London. Centuries later, when Rome was building the city wall in haste and in fear, that tomb was broken up, and its pieces built into the fortification as ordinary rubble. The man who saved what was left of the British population from Paulinus ended up as a stone in a wall. The fragments were dug out only in the 19th and 20th centuries, put back together, and today they stand in the British Museum. So much for the gratitude of empires. And Britain stayed Roman. It stayed that way for a long time, for close to 400 years, right up to the year 410, when Rome, barely alive itself, pulled the legions home and left the island to itself. And what always surprises me is how quickly the towns were rebuilt. We have a London writing tablet with a commercial agreement dated to the year 62, barely a year or two after the burning, concerning the transport of goods from Verulamium to London. Life returned, trade started up, the ash was covered over with new floorboards. That is usually the way with total destruction. It is never quite as total as it sounds in the chronicles. And Boudica, the woman who came close to throwing Rome into the sea, disappeared. And not for a few years, but for centuries. The Middle Ages nearly forgot her. Early medieval chroniclers either say nothing about her or tangle her story up with other people's. She vanished along with Tacitus, of whom barely a few manuscripts survived, somewhere in monastery libraries. A short digression about the name itself, because it shows nicely how thoroughly we have lost this woman. We do not even know for sure what she was called. The form, Boudica, the one we accept today as correct, is a reconstruction established by the linguist Kenneth Jackson, who derived it from a Celtic root meaning victory. Boudica means, roughly, victorious. The Welsh word Budug means the same thing to this day. And for most of the modern era, she was called something quite different, Boudicca. And that form is simply a mistake. It is the error of a medieval copyist who garbled the letters while transcribing Tacitus. And in time, the garbling settled in for centuries, because it sounded dignified. Which means the most famous version of her name is a typo. Even her name reaches us in a Roman version, distorted by a Roman hand. She came back only in the Renaissance, when Europe dug Tacitus up again, printed him and started reading. An Italian humanist introduced her into English writing first, and from there she made her way into Holinshed's Chronicles, the same ones Shakespeare later drew on. And the confusion started immediately, because the accounts of Tacitus and Dio differ so much that a certain Florentine scholar concluded they must have been two different women. So he split Boudica into two queens, good Boudicca and wicked Boudicca. One historical figure, two versions of the story, so let us make two people out of her. Why not? That is how history gets written, when the sources quarrel and nobody wants to choose. And even then, long before Victoria, Boudica was being harnessed to politics. Because in the time of Elizabeth I, when England was again ruled by a woman and a threat of invasion was coming from the Spanish side, an ancient warrior queen who had defended the island against a foreign empire turned out to be the perfect model. Particularly in the year 1588, when the Great Armada was being driven off. It would be hard to find a better parallel than a female ruler standing at the head of her people against a power from the mainland. Boudica turns up at that point in the greatest poets of the day. The island had found itself a patron for hard times, and it would not be the last time it needed one. Then the theatre came on stage, and this is a moment that honestly amuses me. The playwright John Fletcher, a colleague of Shakespeare's in the trade, wrote a play about Boudica, called in English Boudicca. And what does Fletcher do with his heroine? He pushes her into the background. He makes the real hero her kinsman, the brave warrior Caratach, a man of course, who repeatedly scolds the queen for boasting and incompetence, and in one scene tells her outright to go home and get on with her spinning. Go home and spin, woman, spin. The great rebel, the terror of Rome, gets a dressing down in 17th century English theatre for talking too much, and is sent back to the distaff. Every age moulds for itself whichever Boudica it happens to need. And Victorian England needed a very different one. Because for a growing empire, this anti-Roman rebel turned out to be a wonderfully convenient myth, particularly under the rule of a queen. It would be hard to find a better mascot for a nation ruled by a woman than an ancient queen who had led her own people into battle. And once Victoria took the throne, the coincidence became almost too tempting, because the name Victoria means victory, and Boudica, in its Celtic root, means exactly the same thing, victorious. Two victorious queens, one at the beginning of British history, the other at the height of its power. The symmetry was begging to be used. The poems arrived. First, an ode by the poet William Cowper from the year 1782, in which a beaten, bleeding queen seeks counsel from a druid under an oak, and the druid prophesies that her descendants will rule over regions Caesar never knew. It is a prophecy of a future empire. Cowper, as he wrote it, could not have known that it would come true to the letter, under the sceptre of a queen whose name meant the same thing as his heroine's. And then came Tennyson. Alfred Tennyson, Victoria's court poet, wrote a poem titled simply Boudicca around the year 1859 and published it 5 years later, and it is a piece of an altogether different kind from Cowper's smooth ode, because Tennyson gave it not a scrap of patriotic reflection. He gave it a manic, broken roar. He built the rhythm on a wild, ancient metre, once used by the Roman poet Catullus to describe priests mutilating themselves in a frenzy for a Phrygian goddess, and that rhythm makes the whole thing sound like a fever. Tennyson's Boudica stands on a chariot between her daughters, half out of her mind, screaming orders at the crowd so bloody they are hard to read. It opens with Mona, with Nero's legionaries burning the grove and the druid's altar, and then the queen orders the Roman colonies put to the sword, sparing nobody, neither the old man nor the child. And it is interesting what Tennyson was really writing about. Because the poem was composed just after the bloody rising in India, after the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, during which it was the British who were sometimes on the receiving end of massacres. Some scholars therefore read Tennyson's Boudica as a distorting mirror, as a dark warning that this is what happens when a subjugated province turns on its empire. Tennyson took a Roman nightmare and showed his own Victorian fear inside it. The burned colony in his poem is supposedly Camulodunum, but the reader of the day knew perfectly well whose colonies the poet really had in mind. Perhaps that is why this manic poem never made it into the school readers. The establishment preferred Cowper's polished version, the one with the prophecy of glory, rather than the one with the severing of breasts. And you can see it carved into stone, because when the enormous monument finally went up beside the Thames in the year 1902, at the height of the empire's power, that bronze Boudica on her chariot, with her spear raised and her two daughters at her side, The words carved on the plinth were Cooper's. Regions Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway. Cooper's words, not Tennyson's. They chose the version that suited an empire. The monument itself has a history every bit as twisted as everything else in this story. The sculptor Thomas Thornycroft worked on it from the middle of the 1850s. A great champion of the project was Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. He was the one who saw more than coincidence in it, since both women bore a name meaning victory, and he is said to have lent the sculptor horses from the royal stables as models. Albert died before the work was finished. Thornycroft himself died too, in the year 1885, years before the statue was even cast. Boudica took her place beside the Thames, 17 years after the death of her maker, and it is beautiful and charmingly invented. The horses have no reins, and blades have been fixed to the chariot wheels, scythes in the Persian fashion, which Northern Europe never used. But historical truth was of no concern to anyone here, because that was not the point. The point was that an anti-Roman rebel, a woman who burned London down to bare earth, should stand for all time as the patron of the British Empire, an empire that modelled itself on Rome. They set up a woman who destroyed Roman towns opposite the Parliament of the New Rome, and told her to hold her spear high to the glory of everything she fought against. And I will leave you here, because I have no neat conclusion for this, and it is probably just as well that I do not. Boudica means something quite different today from what she meant in the year 60. Then she was a widow who burned 3 towns, taking revenge for a flogging and for the harm done to her daughters. Today she is a bronze statue, the pride of the people she tried to drive into the sea. And we, who look at that statue and tell her story, know her from one source only, from the words of her enemies. Not one sentence survives that was written by anybody on her side. She stands above the river, in the city she burned, described exclusively by the people who defeated her, with her name garbled by a Roman copyist, and none of those who walk past her every day still asks whose story this actually is. Let me know if you want more from Roman Britain or from other forgotten revolts, because I have plenty of stories like this left. Do not forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed the episode. And if not, fair enough. There are others on the channel, and one of them may suit you better. You are also very welcome to buy me a coffee. It costs very little, and it helps me keep this channel going and edit these films through the night. You can also join the supporters group on YouTube, where there are plenty of exclusive videos with no adverts at all. My sincere thanks to everyone who supports the channel and buys the coffees. See you in the next episode.